It all started with an envelope, innocent at first glance but laced with menace. Eleanor Mitchell had spent decades upholding justice in court, but nothing prepared her for the battle brewing on her own doorstep. The morning was crisp, the Melbourne skyline painted in hues of gold and pink as she sipped her coffee on the wide veranda of her heritage-listed Edwardian home, a piece of history passed down from her grandmother. But peace never lasted long in Wellington Grove, not with Veronica Blake prowling the neighborhood like a queen surveying her kingdom. From the moment Veronica had moved in 5 years ago, she'd made it her mission to modernize the estate, replacing character-filled homes with soulless beige mansions. And now, Eleanor was the last holdout, the final obstacle standing between Veronica and her grand vision. Eleanor spotted her approaching from a distance, power walking in her designer sneakers, an envelope clutched in her manicured hands. That look, smug, predatory, sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. Veronica didn't even bother knocking. She shoved the envelope into Eleanor's letterbox, took a few photos of the property like she was gathering evidence for a crime scene, then strutted away, phone already pressed to her ear. Eleanor retrieved the envelope with a sinking feeling. The golden WGA emblem gleamed in the morning light. She tore it open. An invitation. A demand. A warning. Join the Wellington Grove Association, or pay the price. Her war had begun, and Veronica Blake never played fair. Eleanor barely had time to process the threat disguised as an invitation before the harassment campaign began. It started subtly. Passive-aggressive notes tucked under her door, muttered comments from neighbors who once smiled at her in passing. Then, it escalated. One morning, Eleanor stepped outside to find a fluorescent orange notice slapped onto her front gate. Violation notice. Non-compliant paint color. She stared at the offensive sticker, her blood boiling. Her deep blue Edwardian trim, heritage approved, legally protected, was now a nuisance, according to the Wellington Grove Association, WGA. A cold laugh echoed from across the street. Veronica, standing on her pristine white porch, phone in hand, watching. "Just following the rules, Eleanor," she called out, voice dripping with condescension. "We all have to do our part to keep the neighborhood's value high." That afternoon, Eleanor checked her mail. Another letter. This time a friendly reminder that WGA had strict landscaping standards. Translation: "Get rid of your grandmother's rose garden or we'll make your life hell." Eleanor wasn't one to be easily rattled, but she wasn't naive either. She installed security cameras that night, hidden among the jasmine vines lining her veranda. She had a gut feeling. This was just the beginning. And she was right. The next morning, she found her mailbox smashed in. 2 days later, someone dumped a pile of dead rats at her doorstep. Then came the noise. Leaf blowers roaring at dawn, construction crews accidentally blocking her driveway, car alarms blaring outside her window at midnight. But the moment that sent a true shiver of fear down her spine? She caught Veronica standing outside her house at 3 a.m. Eleanor watched from the upstairs window as Veronica and 2 WGA board members whispered in hushed tones, pointing at her electrical box, water mains, foundation posts. They weren't just trying to annoy her. They were planning something. The question was, how far would they go? What do you think Veronica's next move will be? Comment 1 if you think things are about to get much worse, or 2 if you believe Eleanor will outsmart them. And trust me, you won't believe what happens next. Stay tuned. They weren't just trying to force her out. They were laying the groundwork for something much worse. Eleanor Mitchell had faced criminals in the courtroom, but she had never dealt with an enemy like Veronica Blake, a woman who didn't break the law outright, but bent it until it cracked in her favor. The harassment continued. More bright orange violation notices appeared on Eleanor's front door, her mailbox, even her car windshield. Each one more absurd than the last. Unapproved vegetation. Her grandmother's heritage rose garden was suddenly deemed a pest attractant. Unsafe structures. Her porch railing, which had withstood a century of storms, was now unstable. Noise complaints. On nights, she wasn't even home. Eleanor expected the bureaucratic warfare. What she didn't expect was the escalation into full-blown intimidation. One night, as she pulled into her driveway, she noticed something off. The motion sensor light didn't turn on. Her fingers instinctively hovered over the lock button on her car keys. Then, she saw them. Two dark figures lurking near her side fence, whispering. One held a canister, maybe paint, maybe something worse. Eleanor honked her horn, flooding the yard with her headlights. The men startled, their faces caught in the glare. One turned and ran immediately. The other hesitated, just long enough for Eleanor to see the Wellington Grove Association logo on his jacket. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She threw open her car door, stepping out before she could think better of it. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The man bolted. Eleanor ran toward the fence, but they were already gone. A strong chemical smell lingered in the air. When she checked her grandmother's rose garden, the leaves were already beginning to wither. Poison. The realization hit her like a gut punch. They weren't just trying to push her out. They wanted to destroy everything that tied her to this home. The next morning, she took her security footage straight to the local police station. She expected outrage, immediate action. But when the officer on duty reviewed the grainy video, he barely looked up. "No clear faces, no plate numbers, nothing we can do." Eleanor clenched her fists. "You don't understand. These people aren't just harassing me. They're targeting my home, my property." The officer sighed. "Look, lady, HOA disputes get messy, but they're civil matters. Unless you've got solid proof of criminal intent, my hands are tied." She stared at him in disbelief. It wasn't incompetence, it was indifference. And suddenly she understood. Veronica Blake's influence didn't just stretch through the HOA. She had people in the system. Eleanor walked out of the station, her mind racing. The law had always been her weapon, but now she'd have to fight this war on her own. The fire didn't come as a surprise. The timing did. Eleanor Mitchell had spent the last few nights sleeping lightly, listening for movement, watching for shadows. The poisoning of her grandmother's rose garden was proof that Veronica Blake wasn't done. If anything, it meant the battle was about to escalate. She just didn't expect it to happen so soon. It started with a loud crack, like wood snapping under immense pressure. Eleanor bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding. A second later, the acrid smell of smoke hit her nostrils. She threw off the covers and ran to the window. The night was dark, but not completely, because orange flames licked at the edges of her backyard shed, climbing higher, reflecting off the glass panes of her historic home. Her breath hitched. This wasn't just a fire, it was arson. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. The dispatcher's voice was calm. Too calm. "Emergency services are en route. Do you have any idea how the fire started?" Eleanor clenched her jaw, staring at the shadows moving beyond the flames. Two figures. Running. Familiar. One of them limped slightly. An unmistakable detail she had noticed before. Barry Wilkes. WGA board member. Of course. But before she could chase after them, the fire spread. The wind picked up, carrying the flames to the old wooden fence, then to the back porch of her Edwardian home. Her home. Panic clawed at her chest. She turned, grabbing the only thing that mattered, her grandmother's old photo albums, before racing out the front door. The fire trucks arrived 10 minutes later. 10 minutes too late. By the time the flames were extinguished, her back porch was gone. Her roof partially collapsed. The place she had called home her entire life, charred, blackened, ruined. Eleanor stood in the front yard, smoke still curling from the wreckage, her clothes covered in ash. And then she saw her, Veronica Blake, standing at the end of her pristine driveway, sipping coffee from her monogrammed mug, watching. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look concerned. She looked satisfied. Eleanor's hands curled into fists. This was exactly what Veronica wanted. The next morning, the official report came in. Possible electrical fire. Bullshit. Eleanor had her home inspected just 2 months ago. The wiring was perfectly up to code. But she knew what had happened. She had watched it unfold in real time. And yet, when she checked her security footage, her blood ran cold. The files were gone. The cameras had cut out at exactly 2:57 a.m., 30 minutes before the fire started. Coincidence? Not a chance. Veronica Blake had made her move, and now it was Eleanor's turn. She wasn't just fighting for her home anymore. She was fighting for justice. The smell of burnt wood still clung to Eleanor's clothes as she stood in the ruins of what was once her beloved Edwardian home. The morning sun cast long shadows over the scorched remains, but she wasn't looking at the damage anymore. She was looking at the people watching her. Veronica Blake was there, of course. Perched on the sidewalk, pretending to chat with one of her WGA cronies, she barely even bothered to hide her smirk. Her designer sunglasses reflected the destruction, but Eleanor knew she was drinking in the sight of it. Basking in her victory, Eleanor took a slow breath. Except she hadn't won, suppressing the rage burning hotter than the fire itself. There was something bigger at play here, and she was going to prove it. The investigation begins. That afternoon, Eleanor did what she did best, dug deep. She pulled property records, financial statements, and council permits. What she found made her stomach twist. The same shell company had purchased 3 other burned properties in nearby districts over the last 5 years. Every house belonged to someone who had refused to join an HOA. Every fire was ruled an accident. Every property was later sold to developers for millions. And the most damning part? The company was owned by Veronica Blake's sister-in-law. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. So that was the game. WGA wasn't just about controlling property values. It was about eliminating anyone who wouldn't play along. Veronica was driving out homeowners, burning them out if necessary, and flipping the land for a fortune. But arson was a felony. Insurance fraud was a federal crime. Eleanor had her in a vice grip. The corruption runs deep. Just as she was about to start compiling her case, her phone rang. Blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. Mitchell. Silence. Then a voice, low, threatening. Drop it. Her grip on the phone tightened. Excuse me? You think you're untouchable because you wear a robe? You think anyone cares about some old house? A pause. A breath. Accidents happen. You wouldn't want another one, would you? The line went dead. Eleanor stared at the screen, pulse hammering. This wasn't just about her anymore. She'd struck a nerve. Someone, maybe even the same people who torched her house, was scared. Good. She wasn't backing down. She was just getting started. 6. The trap is set. Eleanor Mitchell had spent decades upholding the law, and now she was about to use it as a weapon. Veronica Blake had pushed her too far. The fire had taken her home, but Eleanor still had something even more powerful. The truth. Sitting in the dim glow of her laptop, she meticulously pieced together the evidence. Property records, insurance claims, financial transactions. Everything pointed to a pattern. Houses burned. Owners were forced out. Land was sold to developers linked to Veronica's inner circle. And now, she had proof. The final piece came from an unexpected source, a former WGA board treasurer who had quietly reached out through Eleanor's lawyer. Over coffee in a small cafe outside of town, the woman's hands trembled as she slid a USB drive across the table. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. They threatened me, told me to keep cooking the books or I'd regret it. But I didn't sign up for this. For people losing their homes? Eleanor gripped the drive tightly. You're doing the right thing. And she meant it. Back at home, a temporary rental while she rebuilt, Eleanor plugged in the USB. What she found was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations flowing into the WGA's accounts. And then, immediately after each fire, large cash withdrawals that were funneled into shell companies owned by Veronica's associates. It was fraud. It was organized crime. And Eleanor wasn't going to let them get away with it. She needed to set the trap carefully. Too soon, and they'd cover their tracks. Too late, and another house could burn. So she did what she did best. She built an airtight legal case. Then she made a call to her old friend at the Australian Federal Police. The WGA held their meetings in the community center. a modern, sterile building that stood in stark contrast to the historic homes Veronica was trying to erase. That night, as Eleanor walked through the double doors, every conversation in the room stuttered to silence. Veronica sat at the head of the room, flipping through documents, her nails tapping rhythmically against the polished wooden table. She looked up, flashing that same condescending smile Eleanor had come to loathe. "Ah, Eleanor," she drawled. "Finally come to accept progress?" Eleanor placed a thick folder on the table. "Actually, I'm here to discuss your progress, Veronica. Specifically, the funds you've been moving through WGA accounts." A flicker of something, uncertainty, crossed Veronica's face. But she recovered quickly. "Whatever conspiracy theory you've cooked up," she said smoothly, "I suggest you save it for someone who cares." Eleanor simply smiled. And then, the doors burst open. Federal agents swarmed the room, badges flashing, their voices sharp as they ordered people to stay seated. Panic erupted. WGA board members scrambled to hide their phones. One man tried to slip out the back door, only to be met by two uniformed officers. But Eleanor only had eyes for Veronica. For the first time, her polished composure cracked. She stood abruptly. "This is outrageous," she hissed. "I have rights." "You do. And so did every homeowner you harassed, extorted, and drove out of this neighborhood. But your rights won't stop the AFP from seizing your accounts." Veronica's jaw clenched. "You think you've won?" Eleanor leaned in, lowering her voice just enough for Veronica alone to hear. "Oh, I know I have." And then, as if on cue, handcuffs clicked shut around Veronica's wrists. Her shriek echoed through the room as she fought against the officers, her expensive jewelry rattling with the struggle. "You can't do this," she screamed. "You don't understand." Eleanor simply watched. "You made one crucial mistake, Veronica," she murmured. "You underestimated me." And with that, the reign of Veronica Blake ended. 6 months later, Wellington Grove was a different place. The WGA had been dismantled, its members either in prison or facing heavy fines. Homeowners who had been forced to sell were compensated, and Veronica's personal assets, including her multi-million-dollar estate, were seized by the government. As for Eleanor, she stood on the front porch of her newly rebuilt home, taking in the sight of the fresh Edwardian paint, the restored wooden latticework, the replanted heritage roses. She had won, not just against Veronica, but against the corruption that had tried to consume her community. A soft voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Ms. Mitchell?" She turned to see Mrs. Carmichael, an elderly woman who had been too afraid to stand up to Veronica in the past. Tears shimmered in her eyes. "We all should have fought back with you," she whispered. "But you saved this neighborhood." Eleanor smiled, her gaze drifting over the houses that had once been under Veronica's iron grip. Now they were homes again, not investments to be flipped. She took a deep breath. "This was never just my fight," she said softly. "It was ours." And with that, she turned back to her perfectly restored home, stepping inside, knowing that for the first time in a long time, Wellington Grove was finally safe.